All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we'll be talking about chapters 11 and 12 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Before we get into the actual text, um, I did put together this little family tree thing to help us. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but again, you can see Alphonse and Caroline Beaufort. Again, these are the parental figures. And then obviously their offspring, Victor, Ernest, and William. And then the adopted sister slash future wife of Victor, Elizabeth Lavenza. We do have reference to Justine Moritz, Henry Clerval, but then I did want to introduce down here in the bottom right a couple of new characters we're going to be running into as we move into the monster's narration in chapter 11. By the time we get into chapter 12, the monster is going to reference this family that he comes across in the German woods. The old man, his name is DeLacy. He's got two children, Felix and Agatha. And then later in chapter 13, Felix will have a love interest by the name of Safie. So I did want to introduce these characters and put in a little bit of a family tree to give you a visual that might help you better understand what you're looking at as we get into this text. All right, so that brings us to chapter 11 today. Chapter 11 begins the monster's narration. So again, the frame story is taken on a whole new level. We now have Robert Walton telling the story told to him by Victor Frankenstein, who's now telling the story told to him by the monster in the cave up in the mountains. And so as the monster begins his narration in chapter 11, the monster is going to start from the moment of creation, the moment he came alive. And the way the monster describes things, he's really, even though when he is made, he is 8 feet tall, monstrous and hideous, he is really like an infant. He describes here in this first paragraph, he describes learning how to blink. He's like, by degrees, I remember a stronger light pressed upon my nerves so that I obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness overcame me and troubled me, but I hardly felt this when, by opening my eyes, light poured in upon me again. I mean, the monster's an infant. He opens his eyes and there's all this bright light and it freaks him out. So he closes his eyes, but then it's dark and he's scared. So he opens them. The monster here is going through the very same thing that you would suppose an infant goes through. I mean, just learning about vision and sight, their basic senses. If you think of, from a psychoanalytic lens, if you've studied Abraham Maslow, and you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in chapters 11, 12, and 13, you can see the monster go straight through Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that lowest level, if you study Abraham Maslow, the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of course, is physiological needs, hunger, thirst, shelter, things like that. And so when the monster first comes into existence, this is what he is worried about. I walked, I believe, and I descended, but I presently found great alteration in my senses. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but now I found I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more oppressive, the heat wearing me as I walked. I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of the brook, resting from my fatigue, until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my nearly dormant state. I ate some berries I found hanging on the trees or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then lying down, I was overcome by sleep. So we get some answers here. First of all, after the morning that Victor runs into Henry Clerval, as he is running into Henry Clerval, this is the morning after creating the monster. While he is meeting up with Henry Clerval, the monster makes its way out of his apartment before the town is woken up, before everyone's in the streets. The monster wanders through the heat until he finds the forest outside Ingolstadt. Then he goes down by a brook outside the forest. So just about the time that Victor Frankenstein is returning to his now empty apartment with Henry Clerval, the monster's down in the forest outside Ingolstadt. He goes down by the brook, he eats, he drinks, and he sleeps. He's an infant here, ladies and gentlemen. He is addressing Maslow's physiological needs at the bottom end of that spectrum. That's all he's worried about right now. Hunger, thirst, sleep. And so then the monster starts to describe. He wakes and it was cold and he was scared. He was poor and helpless. Um, he gets into here. He gazes upon the sun and the moon and how amazing the sun and the moon are. I started up and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. The moon I gazed on with a kind of wonder. He's just out in the forest staring up at the moon in awe. Several changes of night or day passed. Um, he spends a couple of days out in the forest, confused, um, not knowing how to survive. Again, he has no father figure since Victor abandoned him to teach him all the things that we learn when we're infants. Um, this scene about he's in the forest. He looks up and he sees these birds, and the birds are chirping and singing. And the monster's so enraptured by their beauty, he's like, I want to make beautiful sounds like that as well. He says, sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but uncouth, inarticulate sounds broke and frightened me into silence. I mean, this scene is so powerful. The monster sees these birds up in the trees, they're singing. He tries to sing with them, and when he hears the sound of his own voice, this rough, inarticulate voice, he is frightened by his own voice. I mean, you can't help but feel some sympathy for the monster as he finds himself alone and afraid in the forest. While in the forest, he comes across a fire. One day, when I was oppressed by cold, I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars, and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from it. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. So the monster comes across this fire, it provides him with warmth. The monster's like, this is amazing, I want to take it with me. And he reaches down to grab the fire and gets burned by it. And the monsters, he's like, how strange it is that this same thing could give me such warmth and a moment later give me such pain. He's kind of learning about that duality of nature that William Blake writes about. If you think back to those poems we did earlier in the year, The Tiger and the Lamb by William Blake, it's kind of that idea. He's amazed that, nature could contain something as innocent as the lamb and also something as fierce as the tiger. So the monster very quickly learns how to create fire. Here's your Promethean connection, by the way. Remember the character of Prometheus from the notes at the beginning, fire representing knowledge. Here in this scene, the fire represents knowledge. The monster learns very quickly that fire can harm him. And this is something we all learned as kids. Obviously, your parents at one point, yelled at you and said, don't put your hand on the stove. You're going to burn yourself. The monster here is learning these things on his own. He has no one to take care of him. So he continues on here. He learns to use the fire, how to rouse it, how to create fire, and he actually learns that the fire improves his food. He learns that if he puts nuts and stuff over the fire, they will improve. But obviously, the fire ruins the berries. And then we have this. We have the monster, other than Victor Frankenstein, we now have the monster's first encounter with a human being. As he is wandering through the forest in Germany. So again, Victor's now in his fits and fevers. Henry's taking care of him. The monster is wandering through the forest. As he's wandering through the forest, he comes across a hut with an old man in it. As he describes here, finding the door open, I entered. An old man sat in it, near a fire, over which he was preparing his breakfast. He turned on hearing a noise, and perceiving me, shrieked loudly, and quitting the hut, ran across the fields with a speed with which his debilitated form hardly appeared capable. His appearance different than any that I had ever before seen, and his flight somewhat surprised me. But I was enchanted by the appearance of the hut. Here, snow and rain could not penetrate. So, first of all, it's almost kind of a funny scene. The monster comes across this hut with an old man in it. And as and the monster doesn't know any better. He just walks into the hut. Hello? Well, he can't speak yet, but he just kind of walks into the hut. And the old man sees him, and I think that line where he's like, "Man, that old man ran faster than his form should have been able to carry him." The monster, or the man flees out of the cottage shrieking, and the monster learns, okay, men don't like me. They're going to respond this way to me. He's learning very quickly that he will not be accepted by men. But now that this man has left his hut, it's now open for the monster to live there. He now has shelter. Again, all those physiological needs that Maslow talks about, the monster now has some shelter. He goes on with his travels, and much of this chapter is the monster traveling throughout the forest in Germany. Through much of that first winter, remember, he was brought to life in November. Much of that first winter, the monster is alone in the forest, hiding out, eating vegetables, creating fires, things like that. And he continues his journeys until, during his journey, let's see here, he comes across more humans. He comes across this young girl. She's walking by. She's carrying a pail of milk. He observes her and her companion, and he starts to follow them. And he comes across this unique situation. By the way, the characters we're meeting here at the end of chapter 11, this will be DeLacy, Agatha, and Felix. These are the characters we're going to start to meet here. And so as the monster meets them, or as he comes across them, he notices that they live in this hut. Now, on the back side of the hut is built into like a hill. And on the back side of the hut is this cave. The monster wanders into the cave, and the monster discovers that inside this cave, there's a crevice, a little break in the wall that he could look through. And through the back of the wall, he can see into the cottage and observe DeLacy and his family. And so the monster now starts to live in this cave with this small hole in the wall that he can look through, but the DeLacy family cannot see him. And this hovel, this cave that the monster will live in, will be his home for several years. And as he describes in the chapter, he notices that, this family, DeLacy and his family, are poor. I mean, they're obviously poor. They're living out in the middle of the forest in Germany. By the way, the name DeLacy is French. So you should be asking yourself, what is this French family doing living out in the forest in the middle of Germany with a monster behind their house? But the monster is going to spend several years living in this situation, observing the family by day, but then going out and getting food and things like that at night. And this gives the monster a chance to have some sort of connection. Dang it, Kamak, stop texting me. Gives him some kind of connection here to other humans. And so this gives him, the important part about this is this gives the monster a chance to observe DeLacy and his family without them knowing he's there. And that brings us into chapter 12. As we move into chapter 12, the monster is in his hovel. He is observing the family. As he describes here, what chiefly struck me was the gentle manners of these people. I longed to join them, but I dared not. I remembered too well the treatment I had suffered the night before at the barbarous villagers, and resolved, whatever course of conduct I might hereafter think it right to pursue, that for the present I should remain quietly in my hovel. The monster, he sees DeLacy and his family. He sees what wonderful and nice people they are. And the monster's like, all I want to do is join them. I just want to be part of that family. I want someone to accept me. He's all alone living in this cave, cold and wretched. All he wants is someone to help him. And so the monster starts to have these feelings for DeLacy and his family. He starts to love them like anyone would love a family. He goes out in the evenings when the family's asleep, and he cuts up wood and leaves it outside their door for them so that they don't have to work so hard to get there. I mean, he does, the monster really starts to develop a relationship with these people. He adores them. They were not entirely happy. He realized very quickly that they're poor. They don't have very much, and so they're not living in happiness. And he learns very quickly that it was poverty. Poverty is what's making them sad. And so very slowly, the monster is starting to learn about human society here. Okay. And you can't help but feel some sympathy for the monster in this part of the text, as he is slowly learning lessons observing this family. This paragraph here. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first, but by degrees I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured, therefore, that he found on paper signs for speech which he understood, and I ardently longed to comprehend these also. But how was that possible when I did not even understand the sounds for which they stood as signs? I improved, however, sensibly in the science, but not sufficient to follow up any conversation, although I applied my whole mind to the endeavor. For I perceived that although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not make the attempt until I first became the master of their language. And so again, the monster here is day by day listening to DeLacy and his family, listening to them speak to one another and trying to pick up the language. He's like, I want to be part of their family, but I can't until I can communicate with them. He also, when he looks upon them, he notices that they're different than him. This paragraph here that I'm highlighting is very key, especially for you psychoanalytic scholars trying to understand the psychology of this book. He describes here, I admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, their beauty, and their delicate complexions, but how I was terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. So the monster wanders out of his cave one day, comes across a pool of water. He looks down in the water, and for the first time, the monster sees himself, and he is frightened. He's like, wait a minute. I'm not human. I don't look like DeLacy and the others. In fact, in all of my wanderings, I look like no other being I've seen. I've seen the birds and the animals and the deer and all this other stuff. I've seen humans. Never have I seen another monster. He's scared of his own reflection. At first, I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. When I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am. The monster, this is, by the way, for you psychoanalytic scholars, this is Lacan. Lacan talked about that mirror stage moment. This is Lacan's mirror stage. The monster, up until this point, the monster assumes he's a human like all others. He can't understand why people flee from him, why they're scared of him, until he sees himself in reflection. And he's like, oh my goodness. In that moment, I realized that I am the monster that I am. When he says monster, he's not talking about morality. He's talking about he is a monster and that he is different than everyone else. Here is your I Am Legend connection. Just like Dr. Neville at the end of I Am Legend has to come to grips with the fact that he is the last human alive, and therefore he is the monster in a world of vampires. So too does the monster here have to come to grips with, there are no other monsters out there like me. By the way, remember, the monster began this entire narration with the idea that at the end of the story, he's going to ask something of Victor. If you think about it, I'm sure you can start to figure this out. And so the monster sees himself in reflection. He becomes aware of his deformity, that he will never be accepted, that he is the monster that he is in reality. And this obviously makes him very depressed. As the monster continues to observe DeLacy and his family through the hole in the back of their cottage without them knowing. And that'll be it for chapters 11 and 12 today. We will continue with this, looking at chapter 13 as we move on. Continue with your reading, and please email me if you have any questions. This video finds everyone well and healthy.